The city skyline glistened through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, a jagged tapestry of glass and steel. Night had settled, and with it came the quiet hum of my own discontent. The whiskey in my glass swirled as I leaned back into the cold leather of my chair, the amber liquid catching the low light. 42 years of relentless ambition. Billion-dollar deals, property empires, my name printed in glossy magazines, under top 10 most influential business leaders. Yet beneath the veneer of success lay an absence that gnawed at my insides, a hollow space carved by time, by failure, by something I couldn't quantify. My gaze drifted to the painting on the far wall, an abstract piece in muted grays and blues. Inertia, the artist had called it. Perhaps he'd named it for me. A man suspended between achievement and emptiness. I took a sip of whiskey, the burn familiar, almost comforting. The door creaked open behind me. James, my longtime assistant, entered, his face composed as always. "You asked to see me, Mr. Graham." His voice was clipped, professional, void of emotion. "Yes, James." I swirled the whiskey again, buying a few more seconds to gather my thoughts. "Have the lawyers finalized the plan for the arrangement?" James cleared his throat, his eyes flicking downward for a moment. "Yes, sir. The contracts are ready for review. They cover every eventuality. No loopholes, no ambiguity." "Good." I nodded, feeling the weight of inevitability pressing on my shoulders. "I don't want surprises." A pause stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, James ventured, "If I may, sir, are you sure this is the way you want to proceed?" I turned to him, my jaw tight. "I've been sure about this for years, James. Love, marriage, all of that. It's a losing game. What I need is control, not another gamble." He nodded, retreating into his familiar stoicism. But I could see it, that glimmer of doubt, as if he pitied me. I despised that look. "I understand," James said, his voice low. "It will be handled as you've instructed." As he turned to leave, a sudden wave of bitterness welled up in my chest. I called after him, "James." He paused, looking back with a flicker of curiosity. "Do you ever wonder if this is all just pointless?" My voice barely rose above a whisper, but it was a question that had been festering inside me for years. James hesitated, a rare crack in his composed facade. "You've built more than most men could dream of, sir, but perhaps some legacies aren't measured in wealth alone." His words hung in the air, a challenge and a lament in one. He left the room, the door clicking shut behind him, and I was alone again, alone with the ache that no success could numb. I stood, walking over to the massive window. The city sprawled beneath me, a testament to everything I conquered. But what did it matter if there was no one to inherit it? No one to remember my name, not for my accomplishments, but for who I was. The whiskey glass felt heavier now. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, a man with everything, yet nothing that mattered. In the silence, my resolve hardened. A child wasn't a gamble. It wasn't an affair of the heart. It was an investment, a safeguard for my legacy, and I would ensure that this time there were no flaws in the plan. I whispered to the empty room, the words cold and final. "I'll leave a legacy, whether love has anything to do with it or not." The engine of my Bentley purred softly as I idled at a red light on Main Street. The city had its usual rhythm, a cacophony of honking horns, hurried footsteps, and the distant murmur of street vendors hawking their wares. The buildings rose like towering monoliths of ambition and excess, a skyline I had helped shape. Yet today, the energy of the streets felt different. Hollow, maybe. Or perhaps it was just me. I drummed my fingers on the steering wheel, my mind elsewhere, when a burst of color broke through the gray monotony of the sidewalk. My eyes narrowed, focusing on the source. A young woman knelt on the pavement, her fingers moving deftly across the concrete with a piece of chalk. Her clothes were faded and threadbare. A baggy jacket, jeans worn to the thread, shoes that barely held together. Strands of dark hair escaped the hood of her sweatshirt, falling over her face as she worked. But it wasn't her disheveled appearance that held me. It was the image forming beneath her hands, a vibrant phoenix, wings spread wide, feathers ablaze in reds, oranges, and yellows. The fire seemed to leap off the pavement, alive with motion and passion. For a moment, the world around her faded. There was just the art, defying the grime of the city streets, refusing to be ignored. The light turned green, and a horn blared behind me. I didn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on her. The defiance in her art mirrored something buried deep within me, a stubborn refusal to be extinguished. I pulled the car to the curb and stepped out, the chill of the late afternoon wind biting through my suit. The sound of my polished shoes against the pavement drew her attention. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, sharp, wary, and filled with the kind of resilience that came from knowing too much pain too soon. "What do you want?" Her voice was rough around the edges, tinged with suspicion. I paused, taken aback by the fire in her gaze. Most people in her situation wouldn't have looked me in the eye, let alone spoken with such defiance. I gestured to the phoenix on the ground. "You're talented." She snorted softly, tucking the strand of hair behind her ear. "Talent doesn't pay for dinner." My lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "No, I suppose it doesn't." She looked back down at her drawing, her fingers smudging the edges of the flames. "You didn't answer my question. What do you want?" Her bluntness was refreshing. I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully. "I have a proposition for you, an arrangement that could change your circumstances." She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. I've heard that line before. Not interested. Her dismissal was swift and final. But I didn't move. Instead, I crouched down beside her, the concrete cold through the fabric of my trousers. "This isn't what you think." Her eyes narrowed. "Oh, I know what men like you want. A quick fix for your conscience. Toss a few bucks my way and call it charity." "It's not charity," I said quietly. "It's business." Her brow furrowed, the defiance in her eyes flickering with curiosity. "Business." Yes. The words felt like glass in my mouth, brittle and sharp. "I need someone to carry my child." Her fingers froze, the piece of chalk slipping from her grasp. The phoenix's fiery wings seemed to wilt under the weight of the silence that followed. She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "You're serious?" Her voice was barely a whisper. I nodded. "Dead serious. No strings, no expectations beyond what's outlined in a contract. In return, you'd have security, a place to live, food, medical care, and enough money to start over." She shook her head slowly, as if trying to wake from a strange dream. "Why me?" The question hung in the air, sharp and brittle. I glanced at the phoenix, its flames defiant and resilient. "Just like her." "Because you look like someone who knows how to survive," I said. "And because you're not afraid to fight." She swallowed hard, her gaze flicking between me and the drawing on the pavement. The weight of the choice settled over her, heavy and suffocating. I saw the battle in her eyes, pride wrestling with desperation. Finally, she exhaled, a shaky breath that seemed to drain the last of her resistance. "And after the baby's born." I straightened, my face hardening. "After the baby's born, we go our separate ways. No entanglements." Her jaw clenched, and she nodded, though her eyes shimmered with a pain she wouldn't let show. "Fine. I'll do it." I offered my hand, the gesture feeling colder than it should have. She hesitated for a moment, then took it. Her grip was firm, her fingers cold against mine. "What's your name?" I asked. "Clara," she said. "Clara Hayes. Edward Graham." We shook, the deal struck. A transaction sealed with ice and fire. As I released her hand, I glanced one last time at the phoenix on the pavement. The chalk lines blurred in the wind, the image fading. But the fire, I knew that wouldn't go out so easily. The drive to my office the next morning felt longer than usual. The city, as always, was bustling. But today, the familiar hum of traffic and the flashing neon signs seemed distant, like they belonged to another world. The weight of my own thoughts pressed on me, and the air inside the car felt thick with the implications of the decision I had made. I couldn't shake Clara's face from my mind. Her eyes, full of defiance, fear, and something deeper I couldn't name. Survive. That's what she'd done. That's what I was offering her. A lifeline, a way out of the hell she called home. I tried to tell myself that it was simple. She needed security, and I needed a way to fulfill my legacy. It was just business. But there was something about her resilience, her fire, that unsettled me. I'd walked away from every connection in my life because of a simple principle: don't get attached. But here I was, drawn to someone I was supposed to use, someone whose struggles mirrored the very thing I'd buried deep inside myself. When I arrived at the office, I didn't waste time with the usual pleasantries. I headed straight to my private suite, brushing past my staff, my mind preoccupied with what lay ahead. Clara was waiting for me in the conference room when I arrived. She looked out of place, her worn jeans and scuffed boots starkly contrasting with the polished elegance of the room. She was seated at the long table, her posture stiff, her eyes darting around the space, as if trying to make herself small. I closed the door behind me and stood at the head of the table, watching her closely. "I'm glad you came." My voice was neutral, businesslike. Clara's eyes flicked up to meet mine, wary but not entirely fearful. "What's this really about, Mr. Graham? You said you wanted me to carry your child. But why? Why me?" Her question hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of it, heavier than any contract I'd signed. But I had no time for hesitation. I'd made my decision. Now it was about making it stick. It's simple. I need an heir, a child, someone to carry on my name, my legacy. And you need security, a way out. She flinched slightly at the words way out, as though they carried more weight than I intended. She swallowed hard, the edge of her jaw tightening. "Security," she repeated, her voice rough with suspicion. "A roof over my head, a little money to keep me fed. And then what? You think I'll just give you a child and walk away like it doesn't matter?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond to the rawness in her voice. It was a truth I didn't want to acknowledge. "It's not about emotions," I said flatly. "It's a transaction, Clara. A business arrangement. No strings attached. No drama. You carry my child, and when the baby's born, you walk away. It's as simple as that." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. The sharpness in her gaze never wavered. "And you think that's fair? You think that's just what? You walk away from everything, from love, from family, and you expect me to do the same? To hand over my child like it's just a thing to be discarded?" Her words cut deeper than I expected, and I fought the rising irritation in my chest. I couldn't deny it. She had a point, but I couldn't afford to feel anything about it. It's not about fairness. It's about securing the future. Your future. Think about what I'm offering you, Clara. A chance to get out of the streets. A chance to build something different. For once, you'll have control over your life. She looked at me for a long moment, as if measuring me, weighing the offer I had laid out on the table. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's not about fairness. It's about survival. And maybe that's all I can do. Survive." Her words struck something deep inside me. It wasn't pride that guided her. It was necessity. She wasn't looking for a way to make a better life. She was looking for a way to escape the one that had been forced upon her. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cold surface of the table. My eyes never left hers. "You'll be well cared for. Housing, medical care, and enough money to start over when it's all over. All of this will be legally binding." I let the words hang in the air. "This is your chance, Clara. Take it." Her lips pressed together, eyes burning with something I couldn't quite identify. She wasn't scared, but she was cautious. A woman who had been burned too many times to believe in easy promises. "Why do you even want a child, anyway?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "A baby is. It's not just an investment. It's more than that. You can't just treat it like some kind of asset, Edward." The sound of my first name coming from her lips was like a spark in dry tinder, igniting something inside me. But I masked it quickly, keeping my voice steady. "It's simple," I said, my tone cold. "I need someone to carry my name, to build what I started, to make sure that all the years I've spent building this empire don't vanish the moment I'm gone." Clara stared at me for a long time, her eyes flicking over my face as if she were searching for something I wasn't showing. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said, the word heavy with a mix of resignation and resolve. "I'll do it. I'll carry your child. But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me." She stood up, smoothing her clothes, her gaze still focused on me. "You'll get your hair, Mr. Graham, and I'll get the chance to survive." The contract had been made, though I hadn't yet written a single word. But as I watched her walk out of the room, her back straight and head held high, something in me shifted. "Survived," she had said. Perhaps we both were just trying to do that. The sterile smell of polished wood and fresh paper filled the air as I sat at the desk, flipping through the legal documents laid out in front of me. Each page was a step closer to making this transaction official, a contract that would bind Clara to me in a way no other human connection ever had. She would carry my child, and in return, she would have the security she desperately needed. I tried to distance myself from the emotions that crept in at the thought of it. This wasn't about feelings. It wasn't about trust or love. It was a cold, hard agreement. One that, when signed, would ensure we both got what we wanted. She would survive. I would secure my legacy. Simple. The door to my office opened with a quiet click. Clara stepped in, her presence far more imposing than I expected. She looked out of place in the sleek, modern space, her worn jacket and ragged jeans a sharp contrast to the expensive leather chairs and gleaming surfaces. But it was clear she'd come here for one reason: to do what she needed to survive. "Come in, Clara," I said, keeping my tone businesslike. "Take a seat." She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room before landing on the chair across from me. Slowly, she sat, her movements deliberate. She looked like she was steeling herself for something far more painful than signing a contract, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was the reality of what this meant to her. The sacrifice of everything she'd known. "You understand what this is, right?" I said, pushing the contract toward her. The papers were thick with legal jargon, but the terms were clear. Housing, medical care, the stipulation that she would relinquish all rights to the child after birth. No emotional involvement. No claims to the child. Just a transaction. There are no surprises here. It's all laid out. She didn't reach for the papers immediately. Instead, she looked at me, her gaze guarded but piercing. No surprises. Just business. I leaned back in my chair, watching her closely. Exactly. Clara's fingers fidgeted nervously with the hem of her jacket. The hesitation in her seemed almost like a final, internal struggle, the remnants of a dignity she hadn't yet fully lost. "Is this really what you want?" she asked, her voice low, as if testing the waters. "To have a child just to fulfill some idea of legacy. You don't even care about the baby, do you?" Her question lingered in the air, thick with judgment, but I couldn't afford to show vulnerability. She wasn't wrong. I didn't care, or at least, that was the plan. But something inside me shifted uncomfortably. I had to remind myself that this was a calculated decision, nothing more. "I care about the future," I said, my tone cold. "My future, my legacy. You're the means to an end, Clara. I'm not going to pretend I'm doing this out of some sense of kindness." She took a sharp breath, almost as though my words wounded her, but she remained composed. "I didn't think you would. I knew she wasn't talking about me as a person. She was talking about men like me. The powerful ones who offered a cold, clinical hand when all that was needed was warmth. A long silence passed between us. She stared at the contract, then back at me, as if weighing the gravity of her decision. Finally, with a sharp exhale, she reached for the papers and began to read, her brow furrowed. She wasn't rushing. She was taking her time, making sure she understood every word, every implication. I respected that. When her eyes finally lifted from the paper, they met mine with a steady resolve. "I don't have many choices, do I?" she said, almost to herself. Then, louder, she looked directly at me, her voice steadier than before. "Okay, I'll sign, but don't expect me to forget what I'm doing. I'm not some commodity, not some piece of property you get to use and discard." I felt the sting of her words, but I said nothing. She was angry, and rightfully so. This wasn't about fair or unfair. It was about survival, just as she said. The sound of her pen scratching across the paper was almost too loud in the stillness of the room. One signature, and everything would change. For both of us. When she finished, she handed the papers back to me without looking up. I watched her for a moment, sensing the weight of what she was leaving behind. This wasn't just a formality for her. There was a cost, something intangible, but real. "Good," I said, my voice betraying none of the complexity of my thoughts. "It's done. You'll be moved into the house within the week. Everything is arranged. You won't have to worry about anything. Except the pregnancy." She nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. I knew she wasn't thanking me. I didn't expect her to. Before she stood to leave, Clara turned to face me once more. "And after it's over, when I carried your baby and you've gotten what you wanted, what then?" I met her gaze, a faint challenge in her eyes, daring me to soften, to reveal something more. I didn't. "You'll have your life back," I replied simply, though the words felt hollow, even to me. "You'll be free to go, to do whatever you want. No strings." I couldn't read her expression as she stood, folding the papers and tucking them into her bag. She didn't speak as she turned to leave, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite place. As the door clicked softly behind her, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the empty space she'd just occupied. The silence felt louder than it should, but I had no time to dwell on it. The contract was signed. The deal was done. Now the hard part would begin. The mansion was a fortress, both for me and for Clara. When I first brought her here, I had imagined that the transition would be seamless, a simple shift from one reality to another. But the moment Clara stepped across the threshold, I realized how wrong I was. She looked out of place, of course. The house was an ostentatious display of wealth. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, art that cost more than most people's annual salaries. It was too much, even for someone who had built it all. But to Clara, it must have felt like a different world entirely. I watched her from the doorway of the living room, her eyes wide as she wandered through the entry hall. She moved cautiously, almost reverently, as if she were afraid that the opulence would somehow slip through her fingers if she touched it too much. The silence in the house seemed to swallow her whole. "You can settle in," I said, my voice cool, detached. "I've had the staff prepare a room for you upstairs. It's all taken care of." Clara turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "Thanks, but I can handle myself." The words were short, curt. She hadn't wanted to be here. I knew that much. But this was part of the deal. She would live here for the next few months, and she would follow the terms, and she'd do it quietly. "I'm sure you can," I replied, offering her a tight smile that felt more like an afterthought. "But there are house rules. The staff will provide everything you need. You just need to focus on your health and the pregnancy." Clara didn't respond immediately. She glanced around the room, taking in the sweeping staircase, the walls lined with portraits of long-dead ancestors who had probably never imagined someone like her crossing their threshold. Her eyes narrowed, though whether in judgment or just confusion, I couldn't tell. "Right," she said, her voice cold but composed. "I'll focus on the pregnancy. You can count on that." I wasn't sure if it was a statement or a challenge, but I chose not to respond. Instead, I motioned toward the grand staircase. "Your room is at the end of the hall. There's a maid service at your disposal, and the medical staff will be here weekly to monitor your progress." She nodded slowly, then turned to climb the stairs. I didn't follow her. In fact, I made a point not to, keeping my distance as I always did. The arrangement was clear. She was here as part of a transaction, and I had no need to complicate it by getting too involved. But I couldn't stop myself from noticing her, not entirely. Over the next few days, I observed her from a distance, the way she adjusted to life in the mansion. Her initial hesitance slowly gave way to a kind of quiet acceptance. She never fully embraced the wealth surrounding her, but she learned how to navigate it. Clara had an unspoken resilience that made me watch her more than I should have. The mornings were the hardest for her. I would often find her sitting by the window, sketching something in her notebook. I'd never seen her without that notebook, tucked into the back pocket of her jeans, as though it were the last thing tethering her to a life that wasn't just about surviving. One morning, as I passed the sitting room on the way to my study, I stopped to glance through the open door. Clara was sitting on the couch, drawing with quick, sure strokes. Her concentration was absolute, her face soft as she immersed herself in the quiet world of her art. I lingered in the doorway, watching her, but I didn't interrupt. It was a moment of peace that didn't belong to me, but I found myself oddly drawn to it. Finally, she looked up, catching me staring. A flash of annoyance crossed her face, quickly masked by the coldness she had become so adept at. "You don't need to watch me, Mr. Graham," she said, her tone sharper than usual. "I'm not a pet. You don't have to check up on me." I raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't watching you. I was simply passing by." Her gaze flickered to the window, the unease in her posture betraying the mask of defiance. "Sure. Whatever you say." She stood abruptly, as if to prove a point, and began gathering her things, but I wasn't interested in her leaving. "Not yet." "Clara," I said, my voice low, the words almost surprising me as they left my mouth. "You've settled in. For now, that's enough. But if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." She didn't respond right away, her fingers still tightly clutching her sketchbook. She looked at me as if I had said something out of turn. For a long moment, I wondered if she would just walk away. But then she sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "I'm not used to asking for help," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "I didn't expect you to offer. But I'll take it. You've done your part. I'll do mine." Her words were soft, but there was a strength in them. The kind of strength that I both admired and resented. "You'll need help with the pregnancy. And with everything else," I said, my tone not as cold as I intended. "You don't have to do this alone." Her eyes softened for a split second, and then the mask returned. "I can do it," she replied, though there was less conviction in her voice. "Just don't expect me to thank you." I wasn't sure why that stung. It shouldn't have. It wasn't part of the deal. But Clara's inability to acknowledge any kindness I offered unsettled me in a way I couldn't fully explain. She turned and left the room before I could respond. I didn't follow her this time, but I couldn't shake the image of her sitting in that room, sketching her thoughts onto paper. It was as if I had caught a glimpse of the person she was beneath the surface, someone more than just a means to an end. But that wasn't my problem. I had no intention of letting myself get too close. She was here for one reason, and one reason only: to carry my child. The mornings had become routine. The mansion was quiet, save for the hum of the coffee machine in the kitchen and the shuffle of footsteps from the staff as they carried out their duties. Clara, for the most part, had settled into the rhythm of her new life. Her reluctance had faded into an almost resigned acceptance, though I couldn't ignore the tension that lingered in her gaze whenever she looked at me. I had made it clear from the start that our arrangement was strictly transactional. I offered her comfort, security, and everything she needed during her pregnancy. And in return, I would have my hair. The terms were simple, and I had no room for complications. But lately, there were cracks in the ice, small, subtle fissures that seemed to widen the more I watched her. Clara's presence was no longer just a matter of physical space. It was like the air around her shifted, becoming heavier, and every moment spent in the same room felt a little more charge. One morning, I entered the living room to find Clara sitting on the couch, her sketchbook open in her lap. For the first time, I noticed her relaxed posture, as if she were absorbed in something beyond the sterile confines of our arrangement. The pencil in her hand moved with ease, her strokes fluid and confident. It was a rare moment of calm in the storm of her life, and it caught me off guard. Her eyes flickered up as I approached. "Mr. Graham," she said, her voice quieter than usual, almost apologetic. "I didn't hear you come in." I nodded, my gaze lingering on the sketch. It was a portrait of a woman, soft, detailed, but with an unmistakable sorrow in the eyes. Something about it felt personal. "You draw a lot," I said, the words sounding almost too casual. "Does it help?" Her lips curved slightly, but it wasn't a smile. "Helps with what?" "With the situation," I replied, trying to sound more indifferent than I felt. "Does it make things easier?" She paused, staring at the drawing for a long moment before answering. "Nothing makes this easier, Mr. Graham, but drawing helps me forget for a while. It's the only thing that feels like mine." I studied her for a moment. She didn't look at me, her attention still fixed on the sketch. The quiet vulnerability in her words caught me off guard. I wasn't used to this side of her, the side that wasn't defensive or detached. This was the first time I had seen her let down her guard, even if only for a few seconds. "You don't have to keep your distance from me, Clara," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. "If you need help with anything—" "I don't need help," she interrupted, her voice firm, the edge of defiance still there. "Not from you." I felt a flash of irritation, but quickly pushed it down. Of course, she would resist. But there was something about her refusal that made me want to push harder, to break through that wall she had built around herself. I couldn't quite understand why it mattered. I changed the subject, wanting to regain control of the conversation. "Have you been to your checkup yet this week?" She glanced up at me then, her gaze shifting briefly before she answered. "Yes. Everything's fine. The doctor says everything's progressing well." It was a simple answer, but something about her tone struck me. She wasn't offering more than what was necessary. Clara wasn't one to share anything personal with me, not unless forced. And yet, the walls she had so carefully erected seemed to be slowly crumbling, piece by piece. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Good. It's important that you stay on top of these appointments. I need this pregnancy to go smoothly." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she closed the sketchbook with a soft snap, as though putting away a part of herself that didn't belong here. She stood up, her posture once again tense, her walls returning in full force. "You don't have to remind me of my responsibilities, Mr. Graham," she said, her voice hardening, as if trying to distance herself again. "I know what I'm here for." I felt a sharp sting at her words, but I masked it quickly. "I didn't mean it like that," I said, my tone slightly cooler than I intended. "I just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself. That's all." She didn't reply, but her eyes softened for just a fraction of a second. Then she turned away, walking toward the door. "I'll take care of myself. You don't need to worry about that." I stood there for a moment, watching her retreat. There was something about the way she spoke, the subtle vulnerability that had slipped through, even in her most guarded moments. For a brief instant, I had seen the cracks in the wall she had built around herself, and I wondered what it would take for me to break through completely. As I turned to leave the room, I caught a glimpse of the sketch again. The woman's eyes still haunted with sorrow, but also with strength. There was something in that portrait, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, that reminded me of Clara. And for the first time, I realized that our arrangement wasn't as simple as I had made it out to be. The distance between us had always been my choice. But now, as I walked away, I found myself questioning whether it could stay that way for much longer. The waiting room was quiet, save for the soft murmur of the receptionist's voice and the distant sound of other patients shuffling in and out. I leaned back in the sterile chair, my fingers idly tracing the edge of a magazine I had no interest in. Clara sat across from me, her posture stiff and withdrawn, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, and for the first time, I noticed how tired she looked. The pregnancy was wearing on her, the physical toll of carrying a child. Yes, but also the weight of the unspoken things between us. She hadn't said much since the last checkup, and I could tell that the distance between us had grown. The walls she built around herself had only become thicker, more impenetrable. She wasn't here for me, I knew that, but I had insisted on accompanying her, despite her reluctance. Something about this felt important, more than just a medical appointment. Perhaps it was the fact that I was about to hear the heartbeat of my future child. The reason I had agreed to this entire arrangement. The nurse called her name, and Clara stood without a word, her eyes briefly flicking toward me before she turned to follow the nurse down the hallway. I stood and followed them, not quite certain of why I had come. The examination room was small, sterile, filled with the faint scent of antiseptic. Clara climbed onto the table and lifted her shirt, exposing the smooth curve of her stomach. She looked uncomfortable, but her face remained unreadable. The nurse prepped the equipment, and I stood back, feeling oddly out of place. My role in this had always been distant, clinical. I had made sure the logistics were taken care of, that Clara had everything she needed, and that the pregnancy proceeded smoothly. But now, as I watched her lying there, it hit me that there was more to this than I had ever allowed myself to consider. The nurse turned on the machine and applied the gel to Clara's stomach. There was a soft, gentle hum as the technician positioned the ultrasound probe, and the screen flickered to life. Clara stiffened, but I noticed her eyes dart to the screen, not with excitement, but with a kind of quiet acceptance. I couldn't help but wonder if she had already started to form some kind of bond with the baby. A few moments passed in silence, and then the nurse's voice broke through. "There it is," she said softly, pointing to the screen. "That's the heartbeat." The sound filled the room, a steady, rhythmic thump that echoed in my chest. My body went rigid. There was something surreal about it, the rawness of it, the sound of life. I had heard it before, of course, countless times in business meetings, in the context of investments, growth, and legacy. But hearing it here, now, tied to my own blood, was something else entirely. And then something else registered. A second heartbeat. I glanced at Clara, who seemed just as stunned as I was. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, as if she, too, were trying to comprehend what we had just heard. "Wait, what's that?" I asked, my voice sounding strange even to me. The nurse smiled gently, adjusting the screen. "It looks like you're carrying twins." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to process them. Twins. The thought should have excited me, but instead, a cold, unfamiliar panic surged through me. "Twins," Clara whispered, her voice strained, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her shirt, as if holding on to something, or perhaps trying to stop herself from falling apart. The nurse nodded, her voice calm and professional. "Yes, 2 heartbeats, 2 babies. It's a bit of a surprise, but it's not uncommon." Clara looked up at the screen, her face a mix of awe and fear. I didn't expect this," I thought. She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. I looked at the screen as well, my mind racing. 2 children, 2 futures, the legacy I had been so determined to secure, now multiplied. There was no plan for this, no calculation. It was a chaotic, unpredictable element that I hadn't prepared for. The reality of fatherhood, of twice being a father, suddenly felt like a weight I wasn't sure I could bear. The nurse left us alone in the room, telling us the doctor would be in shortly to discuss the results in more detail. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Clara's eyes were fixed on the screen, but she didn't speak. I stood beside her, not knowing what to say. For the first time since this whole arrangement began, I felt a deep sense of unease. "I didn't expect this," I finally said, my voice low, trying to break the tension. "I didn't plan for this." Clara turned her head toward me, her eyes soft, though the hardness was still there. "Neither did I," she said, her tone almost like a whisper. "But now, it's real. 2 of them." I nodded, though I didn't know how to respond. The second heartbeat reverberated in my mind, like an echo I couldn't shake. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just a legacy. There were 2 lives here now, 2 innocent lives, connected to me in a way I couldn't quite comprehend. For a brief moment, I wanted to reach out, to say something that would reassure her, reassure myself. But I didn't. The words were stuck somewhere deep inside me, and I couldn't bring them to the surface. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice rougher than I intended. Clara nodded, though her face was tight, her expression distant. "I don't know," she admitted. "This is all a lot, but I'll deal with it. I have to." The honesty in her words cut through the distance between us in a way I hadn't expected. Clara was not just surviving anymore. She was adapting, taking what was given to her and finding a way to make it work, even when everything felt like it was falling apart. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just seeing Clara anymore. I was seeing the mother of my children, the woman who would bring 2 new lives into the world, and perhaps, in doing so, change my own life in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time, I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just business anymore.